You're watching Gravitas. China is speaking in two different languages over the same issue, squatting on someone else's land. Indeed, the contradiction between Beijing's rumbles over its occupation of Bhutan's Doklam Plateau at the tri-junction between the Himalayan kingdom, India and China, and its posturing over its land grab in the South China Seas, which has got all ASEAN members up in arms, are startlingly brazen. Senior foreign editor Padma Rao discloses how the Chinese dragon is not only threatening war, but doing so with a forked tongue.
Diplomatic negotiations between India and China over the Doklam standoff have failed, but the steady stream of wholly baffling rhetoric emanating from Beijing has not tapered off. On the contrary, the drums of war being beaten by China are now being accompanied by some absurd claims. And each comment being made by various spokespersons of the Chinese government make it clear that this is a case of a very charred pot calling a shiny kettle black. China claims that Bhutan now says Doklam is not its territory. Thimphu has in fact done the opposite, condemned in no uncertain terms China's incursion. So if Bhutan has given up its own land to the Chinese now, it must have done so in a Chinese whisper so soft that only Beijing heard it. But here's the thing, there are at least 6 other countries in the South China Sea, members of ASEAN, who have joined hands and loudly told China that all the land it claims as its own in the South China Sea is their territory. That is no whisper, but a very loud and well-publicized statement. But is China listening? Of course not. Analysts from Beijing have wondered right here on WION why India is flexing its war muscles over a mere piece of land, quote-unquote, that is Doklam. But why is China on its other borders and thousands of miles away from its mainland building quote-unquote mere pieces of land right in the middle of the ocean where there were none? What about the 7 artificial islands it has built, complete with military infrastructure, airstrips and radar equipment right in the middle of the South China Sea, which it claims 80% of and has threatened to defend against all neighbouring countries, but also the United States, Japan, the EU, India, Australia and many other countries that have raised objections. Why the war cry over mere pieces of land in the China Sea, indeed ones that never existed till China put them there? Beijing also asked a visiting Indian media team this silly question, what, quote-unquote, India would do if China enters Kashmir. The fact is, China has for long been in Kashmir, ostensibly building infrastructure and its own Belt and Road Initiative. And given that that part of Kashmir is occupied by Pakistan, its ally, it's just moved in with another squatter friend. The Chinese have also growled about, quote-unquote, territorial sovereignty and integrity in Doklam and in the South China Seas. But along its own 3,700-kilometer border to India, there's plenty of land belonging to India that it claims, like Asafila, like Longju, like the Tawang district and the Nakachu Valley, like Demchok, like 545 kilometers from Demchok to Nepal, like Barahoti in Uttarakhand, like the Karakoram Pass to Demchok, and finally like Aksai Chin, all 38,000 kilometers of it, a sovereign and integral part of India's Ladakh. Which way the standoff over Doklam will end is unclear, but one thing is for sure, China is not only a supreme squatter and land grabber, but one that can churn out 2 different sauces, Sichuan style, one for the goose and the other for the gander. Padma Rao, WION.
And joining us for more on this, Professor Swaran Singh. He's a professor at the School of International Studies in JNU in New Delhi, and Ainar Thangan, political and economic commentator with us from Beijing. Good evening to both of you. Ainar and Professor Singh, we've discussed this in detail on numerous occasions on this show. Ainar, I want you to first of all comment on the report that, that we've just played out. The duplicitous nature of Beijing's statements is something that the world is now commenting on.
Well, I'm not quite certain that that's the impression one gets from reading the international press. I think today everyone was concerned about the remarks by Donald Trump and also by President Kim Jong-un. So at this point, I think it's largely been ignored. This is a matter really between China and India. The difference is based on perception of where borders are and who acted first and in what capacity.
You said on the show yesterday that it's just a piece of land, and we pointed out in this report that China is creating many other such pieces of land and squatting on them.
No, I never said that they're creating pieces of land and squatting on them.
That's what
I
we're
said
saying.
that's what you're saying, okay. I think it would be a mistake to go to war over a pasture that's used by, I think, goats for 4 months a year. I don't know that that is going to solve it. India and China will continue to have a border. They need to figure out a way of coming to term to blows. This is not going to help either one's economy. It will not help the world economy. I think it's time for everybody to be an adult and sit down at the table. And I think that begins by drawing away the troops.
Swaran Singh, a top foreign ministry official in China, Wang Wenli, has been quoted as saying, and I'm quoting here, "It is impossible to have a dialogue with India. Our people will think our government is incompetent." That's the gist of the story.
Several commentators have been saying from India that China has internal compulsions, and that is what Wang Li was saying, that government will look weak in case they make any compromise. But it's also interesting to see how China is becoming selective in quoting certain treaties that it has always called as unequal treaties. And it has talked about century of humiliation. And now suddenly it picks up a specific treaty of 1819 and interprets it the way it suits them. To some extent, all nations are selective, but we understand that the capability of Chinese government to control popular perceptions in China, control media, is relatively much better, much more. So we can see that after 15-page statement has been issued, there is a certain enthusiasm again in the media and among academics to talk about that version that is being given to them by the Chinese government. So I think if we see a certain shrill, in last couple of days, this was only expected after the government has laid out a kind of a fact sheet of what they think is happening. But otherwise, there are a lot of things that are never debated in China simply because they don't have opposition parties, they don't have free press the way we have in India. So you have people simply parroting certain things given to them, and therefore nobody talks about how the whole presence of Chinese troops in either Pakistan-occupied Kashmir or in the Shaksgam Valley is some ways contradicting Chinese own laws. Chinese have signed an agreement in 1963 that treats Kashmir as a disputed territory. And now when they talk about China-Pakistan economic corridor, that is violating their own agreement. But nobody raises such questions in China. So what they are fundamentally doing is they are flexing muscles. China and India never had any demarcated boundaries ever in history. We only had frontiers. And all the treaties that China now likes to quote were unequal treaties according to China during the century of humiliation. Now suddenly some of these treaties have become relevant. They want to use that power that they lately have to reclaim things that they think are theirs. And I think it is part of that overall aggressive mood that one notices in South China Sea. Sometimes you have contrarian voices raised there. But I think India's example is going to really encourage a lot of other neighbors who also have grievances likewise with the Chinese.
Aina, do you agree that China is selective? It picks up treaties from the Middle Ages and says this is the place where the boundary lies. It threatens that it will invade Kashmir. It threatens intrusions in Uttarakhand, but it's already present in some of these regions in Aksai Chin and POK. So what is this threat all about?
Well, first off, I don't think we're going back to the Middle Ages. If you do go back that far, you'll find that India and China had no natural borders. What they had is a series of countries in between these two civilizations. It has only come after, in recent times, that India has absorbed many of these countries into its own and has claimed them. In terms of maps, I think, and history, I think both sides can be said to be very selective. I think there's been quite a bit of talk about the Nehru letters and what China's understanding and what their plain meaning is. So I don't necessarily see my colleague's point about talking about history and all of these things. At this point, we have to solve the issue here. Do you want to go to war over a cow pasture? If not, what is necessary to start that process from de-escalate? That
Dialogue.
is simply not dialogue, but they cannot have dialogue from the Chinese perspective until those troops are removed. If it had been a similar situation involving India with Chinese troops in Kashmir helping in a, quote, land dispute, India would be going ballistic, literally. It would be threatening war, saying that there are foreign troops on their soil, and they would demand before there are any negotiations that there seems to be a kind of blindness on the Indian side as to China's concerns. Is there blindness on China's side? I think so also. There's room to share the grievances. But at this point, it's a face-saving exercise. Both sides need to come to some sort of terms. I don't know that bringing the pot to boil in the popular press is necessarily going to help this process.
What you're essentially saying is that China would like peace, but on its own terms. I don't know how it works with a country like India. China has tried that with smaller neighbors and succeeded. Swaran Singh, China has been using its own media to try to browbeat India. And now, according to some reports, there's a group of Indian journalists in Beijing who are being taken around, who are being showing Chinese military establishments, essentially trying to send a message that this is how powerful we are and this is how much damage we can inflict. Does that at some level betray some sort of nervousness on the part of Beijing? They want to project that they are so strong, but at the same time they also want to diffuse the situation.
I think more than nervousness, it is a bit of an agitation that they have, that not only Indian soldiers have pushed the Chinese soldiers back from intruding into Doklam, but the fact that this is one unique area where Chinese are at disadvantage because of India's presence on both sides of Chumbi Valley and, of course, Indian forces being on height. So they understand that they have tremendous limitations in terms of operations, military operations here. I'm not saying that one is thinking of war. In fact, it is surprising that our friend from China is talking about whether India wants war. India has right from beginning been talking about let's have dialogue. That is a standard refrain we have heard from Indian side all this time. But China is ratcheting up repeatedly, and now, all kinds of insinuations, whether their forces can be in Kashmir or whether their forces can operate from, let's say, in the disputed areas of Kalapani region in India and Nepal. This is actually going to make certain nervousness in these neighbors also. Very quickly, to go back to recent history, 1930s, Mao used to talk about China's palm and 5 fingers of the Cis Himalayan states. And then he, in 1940s, used to talk about creating a federation of Cis Himalayan states under China. So this is going to increase panic in some of these states, whether China is really thinking to put their forces in disputed areas that India and Nepal have, or India and Bhutan may have, or any other neighbors India, Pakistan may have. So I don't think this is going to be useful. It is counterproductive, but it's a reflection of the agitation. And the recent shrill is simply because of the fact sheet being issued, and everybody is now parroting that with a louder voice and with a shriller voice, and that is going to end in next couple of days, I suppose. We both need to talk, and I think China needs face saving in this stage, which is being given. Chinese themselves are talking about de-escalation in terms of number of troops in Doklam having been come down. This is their version. I'm not talking, this is Indian version. So that should be a face saver for them very clearly. And India has been calling for talks. If we follow preconditions given by Chinese, then I don't understand what is left for talks. Then we have already agreed on what they want us to do. The fact that we want to talk about this conflict has to be as it is basis, and then you can find out what to solve. And ultimately, trilateral negotiations need to start at some stage to find out the tri-junction point, which is the fundamental problem here, which makes 3 parties a little confused about what are their claims and other parties don't agree. But fact sheet from China seems to be given to us as a final truth, as what version they have given to us is the real version, which is unacceptable. I don't understand how Chinese can think the version they give is final, because this is undemarcated territory, and all 3 have to come to an understanding of where they want to demarcate their boundaries, and that can happen only through negotiations. So the anticipation of India and Bhutan to simply accept the diktat given by Beijing is laughable at best.
Yes, and all over a barren patch of land or a cow pasture, as Ainar likes to call it. I'm going to thank you both, Ainar Thangan and Swaran Singh, for joining us here. The countdown to a military clash has begun, according to the Chinese military, the Chinese press. Maybe both sides should pay heed to what the Dalai Lama said today. Doklam is not serious, he said. India and China have to live together and should learn to live peacefully.